In the forgotten hills of rural Pennsylvania, where the roads stretch long and silent between rusted barns and empty fields, there stood a house most folks hardly noticed. It wasn't old enough to be haunted, wasn't new enough to be curious, just ordinary. White siding, sagging porch, two shuttered windows like tired eyes keeping the world at a distance. People in the nearby town of Bellemere knew the name on the mailbox, Harlan. They knew the man too, or thought they did. Caleb Harlan, 58 years old, retired carpenter, private, polite. The kind of man who never caused a fuss, never raised his voice, never parked crooked in a church lot. You could live next to him for a decade and never really know him. But you'd trust him to hold your ladder, watch your dog, fix your fence. His wife, Lorna, was the heart of their small circle, soft-spoken, church-going, always smiling in that fragile way women do when they've been holding a marriage together with hope and habit. She made lemon bars for the bake sale every June, never missed a Sunday, never left early. Together, they were what small towns expect, stable, quiet, safe. But if you looked closer, if you paused just long enough to really notice, there were cracks. Lorna hadn't been seen at choir practice in weeks. The curtains in their front window hadn't moved in days. And Caleb was changing. He stopped talking to neighbors, missed 2 Sunday services, bought more bleach than anyone could explain. At the local hardware store, the cashier remembered him asking for industrial-grade lock sets, and when she joked about a home security upgrade, he didn't laugh, just nodded, stiffly, and left without his change. What no one saw, what no one could see, was the darkness growing beneath their feet. Because while the rest of Bellemere prepared for another quiet winter, inside that unremarkable house, something unholy was taking shape. And it wasn't just grief. It was obsession. Loneliness distilled into something colder. Something that didn't need permission. Something that fed on silence. Caleb had always kept to himself. But over the years, that solitude had turned inward, hardened, hollowed him out. He spent hours in the old tool shed out back, a place most assumed was filled with old saws and memories of better times. But behind that shed was a staircase. Behind that staircase was a door. And behind that door was the truth. But no one would open it. Not yet. Not until it was too late. Because in Bellemere, the dead stayed buried. And Caleb Harlan, he was counting on that. By the last days of February 2012, the house on Sycamore Road had grown so quiet you could hear the pipes breathe. Lorna Harlan was fading. At first, it was small things. A missed Sunday service, the cancellation of her weekly casserole drop-off at the church. She told friends she was tired, that it was probably just a cold. Something about the air, maybe. "It's just winter getting into my bones," she had said with a smile. But those who knew her best, those who'd seen her hands folded in prayer every week for 30 years, could tell something was wrong. Her smile didn't reach her eyes anymore. Her voice came out thinner. She sat instead of standing during hymns. And then one day, she just stopped coming altogether. Inside the house, things were much worse. Lorna's body had begun to betray her. Fevers that came and went like uninvited guests. Stiff joints. Night sweats so heavy she'd wake drenched and shaking. She lost weight. First a few pounds, then more, until her cheeks hollowed and her eyes sank like tired moons. She was cold all the time, even wrapped in quilts, even with the heat turned up. When she finally agreed to see the doctor in McConnellsburg, the news was strange but vague. A systemic infection, possibly bacterial. Her blood work showed inflammation, some markers off the charts, but they couldn't trace the source. There were no wounds, no recent surgeries, no immune disorders, just a mystery unraveling her from the inside. They tried antibiotics, IV fluids, blood panels. Nothing seemed to work. The doctors were baffled. They used words like rare, unusual, atypical, but they didn't use fatal, not yet. Caleb was there, of course, quiet, stoic, dutiful. He brought her tea, rubbed her feet, sat beside her bed, always with a book in his lap, always watching. But there was something odd about his stillness. It didn't look like love. It looked like waiting. The nurses noted how cold his hands were, how often he wore gloves indoors, how he never seemed to sweat, even in the overheated hospital room. Still, Lorna went home after a few nights. Her condition hadn't improved, but there was nothing else they could do. And Caleb insisted he could care for her himself. So she returned to that house with the sagging porch and slipped deeper into illness. By March 3rd, she couldn't walk without help. Her fingertips were turning gray-blue, her breath shallow and rattling. And sometime before dawn on March 9th, she stopped breathing. Caleb called 911 at 6:42 a.m. "My wife," he said. "She's cold. She's not breathing." There was no panic in his voice, no plea, just a fact delivered like a weather report. She was pronounced dead at 7:15 a.m. The cause? Complications from a bacterial infection. Nothing conclusive. No signs of trauma. No reason to suspect anything unnatural. The doctor signed the certificate with a sigh. A sad, fragile woman taken too soon. No autopsy requested. No suspicion. Because in Bellemere, death was part of life. And Lorna Harlan had always been frail. But what no one asked, what no one could imagine, was what Caleb had touched before touching her. What he had carried home under his fingernails. What had seeped from the place beneath the toolshed into the woman he had once promised to protect. Lorna Harlan was buried on a Tuesday. The sky was the color of ash. No rain, no wind, just cold air and muted mourning. The funeral was small, like she would have wanted. A short prayer, a closed casket, a few neighbors standing stiffly in borrowed coats, trying to find the right words for a woman they'd always thought would outlive her silence. Caleb stood at the head of the grave. He didn't cry, didn't speak. He just held his hat against his chest and nodded when the final blessing was read. When it was over, he walked away before the dirt hit the lid. Some said he was grieving in his own way. Others weren't sure he was grieving at all. There were no flowers sent from family, no eulogy, no wake, just a hole in the ground and a dinner casserole left on his porch that night, untouched. The town moved on like towns do, with quiet shoulders and good intentions. But something lingered. Not suspicion, not yet. Just a feeling. Like someone had whispered during the service, but no one could remember what was said. Caleb, for his part, disappeared. Not literally. He still lived in the same house, still picked up his mail, still drove the same rusted pickup into town once a week. But he moved differently now. More slowly, more carefully, and with a weight that looked too steady to be grief. He told people he was doing renovations, cleaning the place up. Lorna would have wanted that, he said once to the pharmacist while buying surgical gloves and disinfectant. The pharmacist didn't ask questions, because in Bellemere, people respected privacy. They also feared what they didn't understand. The only person who noticed something strange was the UPS driver. He'd delivered to the Harlans for years, boxes of tools, hardware, the occasional book. But now, the shipments were different. Labeled in codes and clinical language, formalin, chlorhexidine, sodium borate, cold packs, biological-grade preservatives, and the frequency had doubled. 1 box every other day, all addressed to Caleb, all left on the porch, never signed for. It was enough to raise concern, but not alarm, until the driver noticed something else. The toolshed light was always on now, even past midnight, even in storms. One morning, he swore he saw movement inside, just a flicker. A shape, lit by a swinging lamp, hunched low over something he couldn't quite see. He told his supervisor. His supervisor told the sheriff. And on March 25th, a welfare check was ordered. Sheriff's Deputy Ellie Mears knocked on the Harlan door just after 5 p.m. Caleb answered in a heavy coat and thick gloves. He said he'd been sanding wood, renovating the basement. Everything was fine. He didn't let her inside, but Ellie noticed the scent immediately. Not wood, not bleach, something sour, metallic, like old rot hiding beneath soap. She didn't press, couldn't without a warrant, but something about his eyes stayed with her long after she returned to her cruiser. Something that didn't belong. That night she filed a report. 2 days later, with a signed warrant and backup behind her, she came back. This time, they didn't knock. They went straight to the tool shed, and when they pulled back the floorboards and followed the stairs down into the dark, what they found waiting below was not just a secret. It was a shrine. The first thing they noticed was the cold, not the kind that comes from weather or lack of insulation, but the clinical, inhuman chill of preservation. Like the breath had been sucked from the room and replaced with something sterile, something dead. The staircase beneath the tool shed was narrow, built from unfinished wood, steep and winding. It led to a steel door, unmarked, locked. They pried it open and stepped into something that no one could have prepared for. It wasn't a basement. It was a chamber, soundproofed, wrapped in industrial plastic from floor to ceiling. The walls lined with heavy-duty refrigeration units. Bright surgical lighting overhead buzzed faintly, casting long shadows on metal tables. A faint hum echoed through the air like electricity holding its breath. In the center of the room, laid out with reverence, was a young woman. Her body rested on a table covered in velvet cloth. She was dressed in a pale pink nightgown, her lips painted, hair washed and braided neatly, her hands folded across her chest like she'd just been tucked in for a dreamless sleep. But there was no sleeping here, only stillness. Too long, too cold. Forensics would later confirm her identity. Emma Dykes, 27 years old, reported missing from Bedford County in June of 2009. Her car had been found abandoned on a forest access road. No leads, no evidence. A name lost in the back pages of missing persons bulletins. Until now. Her body was near perfectly preserved, an unnatural miracle of chemicals, temperature control, and obsessive attention to decay. And she wasn't alone. Behind a second door was what investigators would later describe as a trophy wall. Photographs, hair, small jars, teeth, notes, meticulous records, each labeled by date, each describing in chilling clinical detail the condition of the bodies Caleb had interacted with. He didn't call them victims. He called them companions. One journal stood out, bound in cracked leather, its pages stained and creased from years of use. At the top of each entry was a name: Emma D. Clara T. Melissa B. Dozens. Some were never identified, but one page, dated February 27, 2012, bore a name everyone recognized: Lorna, his wife. Next to her name, scrawled in shaky, almost childlike handwriting, were the words, "Unclean." She touched the wrong things. She asked questions. She wouldn't let it be. It got to her. I didn't mean to. I kept everything separate. I did. She was just close. The forensics team went still, Because suddenly, the pieces aligned. The rare bacterial infection, the confusion in the hospital, the strange lesions, the illness that no one could trace. It hadn't come from nature. It had come from here, from this room, from this table, from these tools, and from the man who had walked Lorna down the aisle, fed her soup while she was sick, and prayed over her coffin as if he hadn't been the one to kill her by degrees. Later, when investigators asked Caleb why he had kept Emma's body, he gave a simple answer. She didn't leave. But he never mentioned Lorna again, as if in death she had become inconvenient, as if love, once contaminated by truth, was something even he couldn't preserve. They didn't understand it at first. How Caleb Harlan, quiet Caleb, polite Caleb, the man who held open doors and sat in silence through every sermon, could have built a secret world of cold flesh and colder intentions right beneath their feet. But the truth, once unearthed, doesn't go back underground. On March 30th, 2012, Caleb was arrested. He didn't resist, didn't run, didn't even look surprised. He just asked flatly, "Do I need a coat?" At the station, he spoke willingly. No lawyer, no tears. He told them everything. How he had found Emma Dykes on a back road, dazed, alone. How he had taken her in. He didn't describe it as a crime. He didn't describe her as a person, just a presence, one that filled the silence Lorna never could. He claimed he never hurt her, but the autopsy said otherwise. She had suffered a fractured skull. Her wrists bore ligature marks, and her body had been preserved not out of reverence, but out of possession. Caleb referred to her not as Emma, but as the girl who stayed. As for the others, the unnamed women in his journals, the scraps of them sealed in jars and drawers, he only offered this: they didn't last. She did. He denied killing Lorna, said the infection wasn't his fault, that she had gotten curious, touched the wrong things. He admitted to keeping the tools in their shared space, but he wouldn't call it negligence. "It wasn't meant for her," he whispered once, head bowed, but it was, and somewhere deep down, he knew it. The trial began that June. The prosecution painted Caleb as a calculating predator, a man who used isolation as a weapon, obsession as a mask, and death as a means to never be alone. They spoke of Emma's final days, Lorna's long, quiet suffering, and the cellar beneath the shed that became a mausoleum for love, twisted into something unspeakable. The defense leaned on illness, tried to build a case around dissociative disorder, trauma, unresolved grief. A forensic psychiatrist called his obsession a rare manifestation of attachment disorder, an inability to let go. But the jury didn't care about Latin terms or diagnoses. They cared about the faces, the journal pages, the photographs, the young woman with painted lips and empty eyes, kept in a cold room like a toy in a glass case. The wife who begged for help with shaking hands while her husband watched her die, carrying disease on his skin and lies behind his teeth. On July 3rd, 2012, the verdict was read. Guilty on all counts. Kidnapping, homicide, abuse of a corpse, desecration of remains, involuntary manslaughter, sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. He blinked once when they said the words, then lowered his head and said nothing. The Harlan house was condemned, the shed torn down, the cellar filled with concrete. The townsfolk never spoke Caleb's name again, not directly, only in passing, only in fragments. The man from Sycamore Road, the woman who faded. That case. For years, Bellemere carried the weight of it like an invisible scar, something ugly beneath its picture-perfect skin.